thinking?
Let's try. Okay, you should hear us now.
Right. Is that working now, Jeremy? Do you want to?
Yeah, I'll have a look at the chat on the side.
Okay. So we think you should be able to hear us now. Yep, great. Yes. Delighted to hear it. And we've gone up to the ghost of Haddon coming to join us. Indeed, come on in.
Yes.
Someone on Haddon?
Yes.
Absolutely. Take a seat, please. No, we haven't started yet. We're most welcome. Good, and I see people are still coming in. So just whilst we're waiting for a few more people to come in, what we're doing at the RAI today is doing two things, or three things. We have the pleasure of hearing our speaker about a subject that he's looked at for some years. We're celebrating his book called Alfred Court Haddon, A Very Great English Savage, which literally has been unpacked, unwrapped today and put on display for the first time. And we have a very nice exhibition on the walls as well, which will, in due course, will go online, I'm sure, so everybody will be able to see it. So, I think, therefore, we can now start. So what we're going to do today is talk about Haddon, and everybody will remember from their lectures when they were a young undergraduate that Haddon is kind of mentioned, but who was he? Was he the brother of Rivers? Was he the fellow teacher of Rivers? Was he different from Rivers in what he did? Because Rivers is also mentioned in the same paragraph usually. But wasn't Rivers a psychological one? In which case, what was Haddon? This kind of story is very, very much in our minds when we think about Haddon. And it's only in recent years, with the emergence of what you might want to call a new type of history of anthropology, which looks in detail at what actually happened, that we've managed to get a little bit closer to getting to grips with Alfred Court Haddon, the man himself. And if we can do so, it's very much due to Ciaran Walsh, who wrote an excellent doctoral thesis on this kind of thing in the University of Maynooth, and has since been busy publishing it in lots of different aspects. And this is the latest fruits of his labour in the Ancestor series from Bergham. So we're very, very pleased to welcome you today, Ciaran, and we look forward to your presentation and hearing about your wonderful exhibition. So very nice to see you.
So yeah, so you can start your slides if you like.
It's not coming up.
The green button?
Rescue.
Yeah. No worries.
We'll try that. Oh yeah.
There we go.
Thanks, Lee. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming and joining us online. Where do I look, Nee?
At us and at the people in here.
So you don't need to look at the screen at all.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, so this is the story of a very short and specific piece of research into a very small part of what Haddon did as an anthropologist, or ethnologist, I suppose is more accurate. And that's something we'll define in the beginning. So, as David says in the introduction to the book, there's a lot more to be done on Haddon. So what this is the initial pull of a thread to unwind what has been written about Haddon since basically 1910. So to begin, okay, in preparing for the seminar, I logged onto the RAI's Instagram account and was struck by the tagline, "The Study of Humankind, Past and Present," because with a slight amendment, it could have been used as a tagline for a manifesto Haddon wrote in 1895, and we start proceedings here. This is a small publication that Haddon published, small essay that Haddon published on the study of anthropology. And if you look at the second paragraph there, Haddon wrote, "At the risk of being tedious," Haddon wrote in the study of anthropology, "I think it desirable to define our terms at the outset. On the continent, anthropology is restricted to what we in England term physical anthropology or anthropography. that is, the study of man as animal. We prefer to retain the word anthropology for the study of man in its widest aspect. And of course, just in terms, this is an 1890s document, so when I quote Haddon saying man, what I really mean is human. We include a wide range of actors who fought to remove restrictions on the meaning and practice of anthropology, changes that would take anthropology out of biology and into sociology. James G. Fraser renamed anthropology in the widest aspect in 1900, calling it ethnology in an effort to overcome resistance to Haddon's appointment to a university lectureship in Cambridge University. So one of the things that happens here, and one of the things you have to get your head around, is that anthropology was the study of bones. Anthropology was the study of cultures and societies. In A Very English Savage, I situate these actions in a culture war fought between conservatives and reformists over the biosocial forces that shaped society. The survival of the fittest in a stable capitalist system, a la Huxley, versus mutuality in anarchic or self-governing savage, traditional, folk communities. And there's a deliberate effort to deracinize savage in this work. And the mutuality and anarchic or self-governing societies, Kropotkin, Geddes, Haddon, and a whole range of other players. This became the central vector of my research into what Haddon was doing in Ireland in the 1890s, which in turn defined what it meant for me to become an anthropologist in 2020. And David was chaired my viva, was external. Some background: I graduated from the National College of Art and Design in Dublin in 1984. The study of art at the time had just been upgraded from technical training, and to earn a degree, art students had to prove their academic ability by studying complementary subjects, which in my case involved a single module in anthropology. Thank you, Lee Comito. This transformed my final year's work in visual arts education into an experiment in structuralism applied to adolescent subcultural style. This was the beginning of a fascination with the idea of popular culture and otherness, which over time became focused on the disconnect between the visual arts in Ireland and a popular tradition linked to folklore, song, and dance. That led to John Millington Synge and the photographs he took in the Aran Islands in 1898, which opened the door to the photo ethnographic archive Charles R. Brown compiled in 1897. And this is the Aran Islands, taken 6 years before Synge went there. The collection also included a selfie Haddon set up in the Aran Islands in 1892, which showed Brown measuring Tom Kennelly's skull and Haddon entering the data into a form designed by Francis Galton for use in the anthropometric laboratory he established in the anatomy department in Trinity College, Dublin in 1891. And this is the form that Haddon is filling out in that photograph. Armed with this evidence, I participated in an RAI research seminar in 2015 and proposed, to some consternation, that Haddon operated as a craniologist in Ireland. It was an open question, which I posed as a provocation. The year before, Aidan Baker, Haddon librarian, and Aidan is joining us online here, unearthed evidence in 2013 which pointed in the opposite direction. And in my rather naive academic way, I characterized this as an epistemic tension in Haddon's work. It has taken almost 10 years to figure out what actually Haddon was doing in the Aran Islands. This is a photograph that when we showed it in the islands, they retitled it Na Talibani, which is the Gaelic for the Taliban. Again, this sense of otherness. And in this seminar, I reflect on some of the main findings and probably add to the original, and hopefully add to the original provocation. First, I situate Haddon's 1895 manifesto in a sequence of events that illustrate the battle for control of anthropology. The sequence starts with Haddon's adoption of the persona of a very English savage in Belfast in January and ends with the publication of his manifesto, The Study of Anthropology, in November. The second strand deals with Haddon's discovery of instantaneous photography in the Aran Islands in 1890 and his adoption of the lantern slide or the slideshow as an ethnographic method and an instrument of anti-colonial activism. The third considers Haddon's role in a rebellion by humanitarian activists and associated ethnologists in September 1895, which led to him becoming an outsider in academic anthropology. I propose that this signals an ontological split that animates the current antagonism between traditional and practical anthropologies. But before I begin, I return to the tedium of defining terms. On the website, the RAA website, I mentioned post-evolutionism, which took a bit of conversation at the Viva, I think, David, in terms of what I mean. Evolution had become orthodox in 1895, and everyone turned to the implications evolution had for a range of social and cultural phenomena, particularly colonialism. Reformers regarded evolution as a natural process that could be harnessed for social reform and looked to sociology / anthropology in 1890 as a way to advance that agenda. Post-Kuhnian, and Thomas Kuhn's work on scientific revolutions has influenced the historiography of anthropology since the 1970s. The word paradigm has become part of the vernacular of anthropologists. Thus, Haddon became the zoological foil for the emergence of anthropology as a social science in the second and third decades of the 20th century. The evidence I collected contradicts this foundational truth, and I contend that the victory of scientific anthropology was less a revolution than the logical extension of Galton's hard science doctrine into the social sphere. The real rupture in anthropology, I propose, happened in 1895 when humanitarian activists, anti-colonialists, and sociologically oriented reformers rebelled against scientific anthropology at a crowded public meeting in the Working Men's Club in Ipswich during a meeting of the British Association, or BAAS. So let's begin in January, a year of rebellion in anthropology. I'll go through this as we move through the slides, so don't panic if it disappears off the screen. So one of the ways I worked, I cut my teeth in the civil service as an organisation analyst, and so I get used to sort of laying everything out in table form. And so what we have here is 1895 in chart form, and brown is the top part, Haddon is in the middle, and then the bottom half is a series of political events and other events that helped shape anthropology in 1895. So we start, the year opens in Belfast, where Haddon gave a lecture on folklore / ethnology, focusing on the social meaning of dance across space and time. The event took place while reports of famine, of eviction and famine appeared regularly in the press. So this is just a screen grab of a search from British newspapers, and it just shows that constantly throughout the beginning of 1895 there were a lot of reports in the press about famine. In his lecture, Haddon pointed out the importance of dancing among savages and how it enters very largely into their religion. Different kinds of savage dances were described, more particularly the initiation ceremonies. This led to a description of the bull roarer, and 2 specimens were exhibited and swung. The scene generated the idea of Haddon as a performer who adopted the persona of a very English savage. I combined this rather formal record of the meeting of the lecture with a description of Haddon that Robert Lloyd Prager, the presumed author of the minute of the meeting, wrote for Alison Hingston Quiggin in 1940. And if none of you have read Haddon the Headhunter, I think Quiggin is someone who desperately needs work done on her, because I think she was a pivotal influence on Haddon at this period, when she joined him in 1907, I think it was. Prager described his friend as a trickster, an energetic and humorous contrarian who dressed unconventionally and enjoyed shocking people. He considered prudish. Charles Seligman added Haddon's striking physical appearance to the mix, and Prager illustrated the history of Irish nationalists with this photograph, and there you have Haddon in the middle, and the Reverend James Houghton sitting on his left, and the Reverend William Spotswood's Green with the wild-looking man with his hand on the trawl. So imposing one on the other, the performance with the bull roarer, with Prager's description, one can imagine Haddon challenging his audience by performing a bull roarer as he had seen it performed in initiation ceremonies in the Torres Straits and New Guinea. This short paragraph has other information of some significance, but given the time available, I refer to dance as an aspect of religion. This registers Haddon's long collaboration with James G. Fraser and signals a point of departure with Thomas Henry Huxley. The reason for the rupture is stated more explicitly in an essay on Papuan dances Haddon published in 1890. And Haddon wrote, "Only those who have been brought up in a faith can feel the emotions of sanctity which an ancient ceremonial calls forth, hallowed as it is by the associations of past generations. It is doubtful whether there is a single race of men, humans, to whom such feelings are unknown, and they may be found to be strongly developed where least expected. So great is the religious solidarity of the human race underlying all superficial differences." This is 1890. This removes Haddon's interest in survivals from biology and situates it in a philosophical engagement with the idea of ancestral knowledges. And I propose 2 points for your consideration here. Haddon was initiated into the Freemasons in Dublin before he left for the Torres Straits in New Guinea in 1888. 4 years earlier, Kropotkin defined the third task of geography and general education as that of dissipating the prejudice in which we are reared about the so-called lower races, and this precisely at an epoch when everything makes us foresee that we soon shall be brought into a much closer contact with them than ever. So in terms of the coming rebellion, Haddon defines himself as one of those who have been brought up in faith and claims a noetic insight into initiation ceremonies that is alien to an agnostic like Huxley. I propose this paragraph was a statement of rupture between Haddon and his presumed master. It was not the only rupture in 1895. Prager and Francis Joseph Bigger invited Haddon to deliver a lecture on his ethnographic work in the Aran Islands and so kickstart the organised collection of folklore as part of a wider Gaelic revival agenda in the Belfast Naturalist Field Club. Haddon introduced himself as a representative of the Ethnographic Survey of the UK, inaugurated by Haddon and the Folklore Society in 1892. The E.W. Braybook, am I pronouncing that properly, was a member of the Folklore Society and replaced Haddon as the chair of a committee organising the UK survey in 1893. He was elected president of the Anthropological Institute in 1895, the first cultural president in a system of alternating physical and cultural presidents, which Tyler demanded in 1893. In his presidential address in 1896, Braybook supported Haddon's call for the study of humankind in its widest aspect. He wrote that it is right to study man as a whole, function as well as structure, thought as well as action, is the doctrine taught by the Ethnographic Survey, in which this institute has taken so much interest. This was laid down as the principle of its procedure by Professor Haddon when he first suggested it, and is unquestionably right. Haddon demonstrated what this looked like in a series of slideshows between March and May of 1895. Sorry, we should put that up earlier. That is Braybook's anniversary address to the members of the RAI in the Anthropological Institute, as it was at the time, which I've just quoted from. So the spring, early summer, Haddon gives a series of lectures, and one of them transfers from the British Association meeting to the Temperance Hall in Hexham. And what you can see on the left-hand side is that the reports that appeared in the Irish press at the first half of the year are now beginning to spread through regional newspapers. And this is a sample of the slides that Haddon would have used. And these are taken from the photographs that are on exhibition here in the RAI. This is a sample of slides in Haddon's collection, which Andrew Francis Dixon took in 1890, and Haddon included the last two in his first ethnographic slideshow later in the same year. At the same time, shortly afterwards, Haddon gave a lecture to the Folklore Society on photography and folklore. And in that, even the most anthropometric of the photos Haddon took, craniology by photography, they included other information. So what Haddon is showing is a sort of a typical anthropometric portrait, side and front profiles, but the tree in the background is Saint Sournic's thorn, and Saint Sourny, or Nave Sourny, was the only female to establish a monastery on the Aran Islands, and this tree was known as her tree because it was thought to mark the place for burial. And in his lecture to the Folklore Society, Haddon uses it to illustrate the folklore of trees. So Elizabeth Edwards' work on excess information in Haddon's photographs, it was deliberate, and this slide illustrates the multivalency that Haddon thought should be a feature of every ethnographic photograph, capturing anthropology in its widest aspect, as it were. So then, at the same time, just after he gave this lecture, he was involved in organising 2 expeditions to the Aran Islands, one by the newly formed Irish Field Club Union and English Friends, the other by the Royal Society of Antiquaries in Ireland. And they happened in what was a very busy summer. These shots record the naturalists and antiquaries landing in Kilmurray Beach on Inishmore, the largest of the 3 islands. And generally speaking, what you had was that you arrived by boat and were transferred onto the island by canvas-covered canoes, or currachs as they're called. These are more photographs taken during the Antiquaries expedition. These shots, Haddon is in the photo on the left. Note in the photograph below that practically everyone has a camera. Also note who is behind the camera in the photo on the right, an inversion that punctures the idea of the antiquarian gaze. And to emphasize the point, this is one of the first photographs Dixon took for Haddon on the Aran Islands. So you have a complete reversal. So, and now when you go to these forts, there are big signs: don't climb the walls. So Haddon's next gig was the Summer Art and Science meeting Patrick Geddes and J. Arthur Thompson, without a P, organised. 3 brief points on this. Haddon briefly shared Michael Foster's lab in Cambridge with Geddes when they were students, and they remained friends for life. 2. Elise Reclus, one of the recognised leaders of anarchism in Europe, was the keynote speaker. Geddes introduced Haddon to his work in 1888, 1889, 1890. 3. Haddon may have, it's slightly blocked by the screen, may have participated in a programme of popular lectures illustrated by Limelight. And this whole area, what was happening around the art and science meetings, is an area that also needs a lot more work done on it. Especially the relationship between Geddes, Haddon, Morton, Reclus, Haddon, and Kropotkin. So we go back to the list of presidents. Flinders Petrie was elected president of Section H in 1894 and asked Haddon to participate in a debate about colonialism under the provocative title, and this is important, on interference with the civilizations of other races, which the BAS dropped in a transcript of its proceedings and replaced it with on the contact of European and native civilizations. Lest there be any doubt that Haddon was a colonial scientist, he opened his speech with a critique of colonial affairs in the Aran Islands and continued with an unequivocal attack on Anglo-Saxon colonialism in general. He told the packed hall that, even at home, the Anglo-Saxon cannot profess to be in entire sympathy with the Celt or to have successfully coped with mutual political problems. How much more difficult then is it for us to deal sympathetically and wisely with savage and barbaric peoples? And savage and barbaric being technical terms for stages of development of civilizations. He continued into very dangerous territory, the linked topics of assimilation and genocide. If we take it upon ourselves, the regulation of half the planet, we should at least see that we do no injustice. Our aim should rather be to develop the native institutions in as natural a manner as possible, and not to attempt to make the people conform to our usages. In fact, to try and make them Anglo-Saxons. The task is an impossible one. Even if it were possible, it would be highly undesirable. One certain result of the effort is the degrading or extermination of the natives. It may be replied that we have no desire to exterminate native populations. Theoretically, we may not. But I would remind you of that fearful page on the list of the history of our colonies, the extermination of the Tasmanians. Sorry, you should have brought that up. The press covered the story. Many articles pointed out 2 things. There was a huge attendance. Haddon attacked empire, state, and church. Some articles were very critical of Haddon's tone and content. He filed a clipping from the Daily News, this one on the bottom here, on the Daily News, that rejected Haddon's criticism of missionaries and declared the kind of talk which is indulged in the anthropological section is not likely to aid their correction and has no connection whatsoever with science. And that was one of the milder criticisms of his speech. Haddon responded with the study of anthropology, and the penultimate paragraph brings us back to the history of dancing, from sacred pantomime to the sacred pantomime of the savage to the most attenuated modern survival. This brings us back to his lecture in January and his observation that the significance of a certain class of children's games were of interest to anthropologists. These games were the subject of fieldwork Clara Patterson undertook outside Belfast on behalf of Alice Gaum and Haddon, and Alice Gaum of the Folklore Society, documenting the daily lives and secular and sacred rituals of a community, and threw up all sorts of formal representational problems for Haddon. In this respect, the last event noted was in 1895 was the Lumiere Brothers exhibition of the new art and cinema. And I turn to Haddon's long experiment in representing experiment in and advocacy of photography as the principal method of anthropology in its widest aspect. So this is a dance recorded on a hill outside Belfast, just above, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Belfast, just above the Stormont buildings. Okay. Are you still awake? I'm finishing at 5. Okay. Yeah, we should be okay. Yeah.
Take your time.
Okay. Strand through in this section. In this section, what in the book I call it the fifth field of anthropology, the Haddon visual histories and the beginning of visual anthropology. This strand deals with Haddon's discovery of instantaneous photography in the Aran Islands in 1890 and his adoption of the slideshow as an ethnographic method and an instrument of anti-colonial activism. The central theme of the Haddon and the Aran Islands exhibition, which is here, and constitutes visual history of Haddon's pioneering work in visual anthropology. I'll begin with the discovery of the Dixon negatives in 2014. Haddon and Dixon spent a week in the Aran Islands in July-August 1890 and documented every aspect of island life. On the return to Dublin, Haddon sent a selection of the negatives to photographer R.J. Walsh in Belfast to be processed as lantern slides. Walsh returned them in a box, this box here, and I don't know if the label is visible, but it's addressed to Haddon, care of Dixon. Walsh returned them in a box. The camera in the photograph is a generic quarter plate that fits the slide holder Dixon used, which is in the foreground. The photograph may be a first generation contact print made by placing the negative against a sheet of photographic paper and exposing both to light. So, and the camera is not the camera that Haddon and Dixon used, and that's lost. But the slide holder and the negative box are original. Okay, the shot on the left is the underside of the Anatomy Theatre, the old Anatomy Theatre in Trinity College, Dublin, and the lighted area at the back was a storage section in a workroom, and it was on that shelf that the negatives were. The two other cameras in the bottom were portable cameras that Brown started developing. So you had to move away from the stand camera to portable falling plate cameras. That is, you had maybe 10 or 12 glass plate negatives in the back of it, and as you took one photograph, you pressed the lever, the exposed plate fell and another one was moved into position. So it's the beginning, it's the iPhone 16 at the time. It's the beginning of advanced portable mobile photography used in an ethnographic context. So this strand, so this is just literally taken as we opened the box, and being in an anatomy department, there were plenty of light boxes and the slides were put out, and we were immediately able to identify that these were the 1890 photographs from the photograph in the top left, which is of Haddon subsequently, and this is the negative, Haddon subsequently called two sheep in a field. And the way we can identify it is that you may just be able to make out the ship at anchor in the background, and that's the SS Fingal on which Haddon was travelling. Now, the key thing about these negatives, and it's quite a rare feature of them, Walsh photoshopped them. There was sometimes you had an imbalance between the exposure of the sky and the exposure of the landscape, and Walsh, being a bit of a perfectionist, blocked out the skies in most of these slides with orange paper, and then defined the line between the sky and the ground using red oxide paint. And you can see in the file that you have this wonderful clear sky, not a cloud in sight, and a field with two sheep. And okay, this strand deals with Haddon's discovery of instantaneous, oh sorry, I've done that. Haddon summarised the taking of the photographs in his journal, which Aidan Baker, Haddon librarian, unearthed in 2013 in the locked room in the Haddon Library, 100 years after the latest date on a document in the file. Haddon recorded in his journal, "I can't tell you all the excursions we made in Ireland. It would be as tedious for you to read as for me to write, and suffice it to say that Dixon and I left very little unseen, and what with sketches and photographs, we have a good deal on paper." And if you can see at the furthest monument on the right, you can see Dixon has taken a photograph of Haddon with his notebook. And Haddon returned the favour of Dixon with his camera photographing a shell midden. The exhibition in the RAI at the moment features 10 of these photographs as shown in Haddon's first slideshow on the Aran Islands, plus 15 other photographs from this and other collections in Dublin and Cambridge. But the key thing, while Dixon was photographing, Haddon was sketching. Haddon trained as an artist, and he used a combination of sketches and photographs. This is his photographs. They attended a regatta on the 3rd of August. Haddon had a very heavy stand camera with him, which he couldn't use, so he was making quick sketches in this sketchbook. And then he records events. In the meantime, Dixon, with his quarter-plate camera, has recorded 3 men carrying a boat to the ground. And Haddon said, the conditions were dull and the wind was strong. Haddon couldn't use his camera, and whatever results Dixon got were better than any sketches that Haddon was able to make. And this is the pivotal moment in Haddon's discovery of instantaneous or social documentary photography. So we go back to 1888 and where this process started. Haddon trained as an artist, and he used a combination of sketches and photographs in the Torres Straits in New Guinea. After he returned, he spent a lot of time trying to get an illustrated monograph of his journals published, a project not realised until Anita Hearl and Jude Phillip published Recording Costume in 2020. And any of you interested in this part of Haddon's, it's an essential book. He discovered instantaneous photography in the Aran Islands in 1890, and sorry, I have that. Sketching and photography were the primary ethnographic methods when he hadn't employed when he first went to the Torres Straits in 1888, using the missionary statement Samuel MacFarlane established in Mare as a base while he explored the more dangerous territory in New Guinea. Hadn't told Geddes and MacFarlane that he wanted to bring an artist with him, but MacFarlane warned him that he would be treated as a commercial collector and as such would pay more for everything and would not have access to the missionary network and the boat. So two tropes of Haddon embedded in the history of anthropology go there. First of all, that Haddon travelled to heavily missionized societies, and also that he was very indebted to the missionaries that he worked with. Haddon went alone and brought a camera, Walsh probably having trained him in field photography, and this is what Haddon recorded in his first day in the field. And the beauty of this is that you can actually see exactly what he did when he landed on the island of Najir. Sketch 1, sketch 2, sketch 3, sketch 4, and if you notice, there isn't a single coral reef or sea anemone anywhere. He has no interest in marine biology or zoology at this stage. And then in his diary, he transfers his sketches from a sketchbook into his journal, and at the end of it, he writes the very last line: the following sketch will give a better idea than words only. So already before he went to the Aran Islands, he's already beginning to prefer sketches over words. And 2 days later, he used his limited supply of photographic negatives to photograph a circular dance in Moata. Probably one of the photographs in an exhibition Haddon and Flower curated for the British Museum in October 1889. This is from the British Museum collection. So the problem Haddon confronted in his first week in the field in the Torres Straits and New Guinea was, how does an ethnographer capture the full effect of a ritual danced for the last time? These sketches and photographs and journal entries show Haddon grappling with the former problem of representation at the very beginning of mobile field photography, made possible 10 years earlier by the introduction of mass-produced dry plate negatives. Margaret Mead grappled with the same problem at the 9th International Congress of Anthropological and Ethnological Sciences held in Chicago in August and September in 1973, 50 years ago. She posed a question that the traditional methods anthropologists or ethnographers use in the field were incapable of capturing the full effect of a of a ritual dance for the last time. And it's quite a scathing critique of traditional ethnographic methods developed by Radcliffe Brown and Malinowski. In 1888, Haddon had 3 problems to solve. The first one is motion. Haddon solved this with the introduction of a Newman Guardia cinematic camera in 1898 in the Torres Straits. And this is Gadodo, Mama, and Pasa in Mare. And you can actually see that it's only the central photograph, the static one, that is actually quite usable. Colour. Arthur Haddon, known as Trevor, like his mother, trained as an artist and converted his brother's field sketches into colour paintings for reproduction as chromolithographs in this archive this article in the Archive for Ethnographie. 10 years later, Haddon, well, this was 1893, but 10 years after his first experiments in the Torres Straits, hadn't experimented without success with the Joly colour process, which was withdrawn shortly afterwards. The Lumiere brothers brought the first viable colour process to market in 1907. The third one was sound and materiality. Sound problem was solved in 1898 by having bring in a phonograph recorder, and this is Meyer's recorded Eli singing songs. And what amazes me is that someone like Emile Brigard describes Haddon as having perfected the sort of the recording processes of the natural scientist, yet photographs like this are highly prized by ethnographers as examples of genuine and productive contact between the collector and the source. Haddon solved the solved problem by including a phonograph in his ethnographic sound kit, and on February 14, 1905, he demonstrated the use, and the following year in Cambridge, he demonstrated the use of a phonograph as a combination of cinematography and sound recording as an ethnographic method. And in the first performance, in the first screening in this institute, Meyer sang the songs, and in the second performance, in the second screening in Cambridge, they used the recordings. And this is a review of the event from the Optical Lantern and Cinematograph Journal, which was the first trade journal of a developing cinema industry in Britain. And if you want to see more, this is Michael Eaton, and this is his film on the Mask of Mer, which covers a lot of the same ground. And one of the interesting things that Michael said earlier on, when he studied in Cambridge over 4 years, he never heard the word Haddon mentioned once. So that brings all the elements together that I've just covered. Right, part 3, 5 minutes.
Take your time.
Yeah.
Take your time.
Okay. Anyone know what this is? Anyone guess?
It's fingerprints.
Yeah.
Fingerprint.
Okay, so my question here is, what does Haddon's work tell us about the nature of anthropology today? I found this sheet of practice thumbprints in the records of the Dublin Anthropometric Laboratory. I show it here because this is what the so-called security paradigm looked like in 1891. Galton's work on fingerprinting, which became an essential part of the rhetoric justifying government investment in anthropology as a practically useful science discipline. Collecting specimens, fingerprints, was an important function of Galton's laboratory network of laboratories in London, Cambridge, Dublin, and a mobile lab that operated at annual meetings of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. Galton collected over 8,000 sets of prints and produced a workable fingerprint classification system. Every person, starting at the top left, every person measured in the Dublin Anthropometric Laboratory was registered on a separate form. And here we have Haddon, and interestingly, he gives his address in Cambridge in 1892, not 1893. The schedule of measurements eventually agreed in 1984, which is the one on the right, was a compromise between anatomists interested in physical function and physical anthropologists interested in racial origins. And Galton's theory of type formation provided a common ground of sorts. So what you have in the Aran Island schedules of measurement, you have a switch from the measurement of physical efficiency to the recording of physical characteristics. And the key thing is that the section for thumbprints, which Galton insisted on, have in the lower form for the anthropological laboratory in Trinity College Dublin are used to record nose profile, and in the form that was agreed after much disagreement in 1894, Topinard's index of nasal profiles is inserted instead of the space for fingerprints. Haddon abandoned fingerprinting when the anthropometric laboratory moved to the Aran Islands in 1892 and became the anthropological laboratory. So you have the title on the top of the form, and then you have the stamp at the bottom. The data field for fingerprints is used to record information on nasal profiles, and the form agreed in 1894 formalised the change by adopting Topinard's index. Nevertheless, the use of fingerprints for the identification of criminals remained a major selling point for anthropology as a practical science. In parallel, Cunningham was developing an academic discipline in TCD that was grounded in a combination of a medical training and the application of the quantitative methodology Galton imposed in anthropology in the 1880s. Flower told members of Section H in 1894, the 10th anniversary of the establishment of the section, that the real value of anthropometry, anatomy plus statistics, was not to be found in the traditional field of race comparison, research carried out for its own sake, but in the capacity to elucidate various social problems. Flowers cited Cunningham and Brown as pioneers of academic anthropology. Brown graduated in 1892 and immediately departed for the Aran Islands, set up a laboratory outside the island dispensary and measured 27 islanders. Haddon, not an anatomist, recorded the data for Brown. So Brown then comes into the development. So 3 events there: his work in what we call Erris, Mullet and Inishgay, and in Ballycroy. And the third item I've highlighted there is the general election of 1895. Cunningham was engaged with the threat posed to the political integrity of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland by the unassimilated and dangerous Irish who supported Home Rule. In 1894, he dispatched Brown to Mayo to investigate the social conditions that had led to an outbreak of typhoid in the Inishgay Islands, which had become a lightning rod for anti-British sentiment in the 1895 general election. Brown duly reported the cause as the unsanitary conditions of the dwellings, and the Tories used this to refute nationalist claims. His anthropometric research and status as manager of the anthropological laboratory guaranteed the reliability of his findings, which he summarised in a pair of photographs in the ethnography of Ballycroy, County Mayo, which the Royal Irish Academy published in 1896. Brown compared a prosperous Anglo-Irish subject with the ragged, unassimilated native and materialises in the process an Irish intervention. Contrast this with 2 photographs Haddon and Dixon took in the Aran Islands. These celebrate the failure of colonialism in what Haddon described as the degrading of the civilizations of other races. The problem here is that Haddon has gone down in history as the colonial scientist tainted with scientific racism. This is largely the result of a critique of the Imperial Institute he wrote in 1891 and drew on in his speech in Ipswich in 1895. That matters here because it speaks to the idea of ideological constraint, knowledge production, and strategic historiography. It took a while to find this document because someone misfiled it. I suspect George Stocking Jr., who transcribed it in the 70s and published it in the History of Anthropology newsletter in 1895. So this is the envelope. It was 2 files away from where it was recorded, and this is the search that went on in Trinity, or in the Cambridge University Library, and this is what it looked like. And then you have the first transcription and publication of this document in the History of Anthropology newsletter. The document has entered history as a proposal to establish a Bureau of Ethnology. Haddon envisaged this as a humanitarian agency that would protect indigenous populations in annexed territories. He set out his rationale on page 10 of the manuscript. It is hardly possible for those who have not visited the colonies to realise how very deep, bitter and undisguised discontent is, contempt for natives. The Anglo-Saxon ruthlessly forces every native into his own Procrustean bed of usage and belief, and in this is supported by the resources of the Imperial Army and Navy. The result of this policy is that we exterminate slowly or rapidly, unintentionally or by force, the inhabitants of the countries we annex. The blame lies alike with the general public, the legislators and the executive. Ignorance engenders callousness, which is the fertile mother of injustice, cruelty and legalised murder. Haddon spent a year trying to get it published, and in January 1892, Huxley advised him not to publish it on the basis that the proposals would not be acceptable to government. He advised Haddon to engage with Section H and the Anthropological Institute and concentrate on physical anthropology. With regard to strategic historiography, Helena Kuklik, 1991, the Savage Within, interpreted Haddon's proposal as a systematic basis for enlightened colonial administration, and James Urry agreed in 1993. Stocking concluded in 1995 that it was a scheme for enlightened imperial self-interest. I think of this consensus as an academic trend that generated the handmaiden of empire trope. The takeaway here is that Stocking noted in the newsletter that organised anthropology adopted the proposal but dropped references to legalised murder and British aggression. Instead, future appeals, and I quote, for the practical utility of anthropology were to be cast in a language that an audience of imperialists might regard as less charged. So, we come to moving on to 2023 and a recent conference on why technology needs anthropologists. I see little difference between what Stocking described and recent attempts promoting the practical utility of anthropology in the field of technology, security, industry, healthcare, and so on. The mission of this event is to persuade industry that anthropologists drawing on theories from anthropology, their own research experience, and applied industry experience can answer questions such as, how can anthropological knowledge contribute to the IT and robotics industry? I tend to invert manifestos like this and read these as reasons anthropology needs technology. Either way, facing towards the anthropological community, the organisers promise that they can demonstrate how new technologies can be used to reduce inequalities, communicate cross-culturally, and promote values of inclusion, diversity, and tolerance, which is essentially the mission statement Haddon set out for the Imperial Bureau of Ethnology. It is an uneasy combination, and the main takeaway here is how, over the history of anthropology, any given operational environment shapes disciplinary rhetoric while indexing how internal politics and external power relations configures state-supported knowledge production. The Braybook explained why the tone, Braybook explained why the tone of Haddon's original proposal was turned down. He told members of the Anthropological Institute in 1896 that he must separate myself from the doctrine of my valued friend Dr. Toppenard in his ardour to repress a tendency to the discussion under the name of anthropology of a variety of social, moral and religious topics. And essentially Braybook there is underlining and justifying the arguments Haddon made in the study of anthropology. Yet Dr. Toppenard's doctrine prevailed when Cambridge University elected a craniologist to the first university lectureship in anthropology in 1899 and offered Haddon a precarious position in ethnology after Fraser lobbied against the original decision. Moving the clock forward to 2020, Sarah Green, outgoing president of the European Association of Social Anthropologists, considered the problem of constrained knowledge production in the March 2020 edition of the association's newsletter. She described a perfect storm in which populism and a drift to authoritarianism drove a backlash against social science departments, while structural changes in universities introduced auditing regimes that prioritized research income and promoted a dependence on external research funding, all of which discouraged or actively inhibited an engagement with social issues just such as reproductive rights, LGBTQI+ issues, gender relations, asylum and migration. It sounds very like the doctrine of Dr. Toppenard, and I conclude that knowledge productions have always shaped debate about what anthropology means in an academic setting. That is the lesson Haddon learnt in the Aran Islands in 1895. The word famine was as politically toxic in 1890 as terror is today. Genocide was less so because that could be explained as a natural consequence of the evolutionary struggle for survival, a debate which Haddon sided with Kropotkin against Huxley. Indeed, as the script of the slideshow reprinted here in the exhibition shows, Haddon was bold enough to link famine and genocide to colonialism in the Aran Islands, and that cost him his career as a government marine biologist in 1890 and his chance to become the first anthropologist in Cambridge 9 years later. The records of the Anthropological Institute show how the defeat of Haddon and his associates in 1895 marked the end of a humanitarian tradition grounded in Enlightenment philosophy and reformist politics. Anthropology had, to borrow a phrase from Jacques Morel and Arnold Thackeray, who coined the phrase to describe ethnology in the 1840s, had been stripped of its dangerous features and become sufficiently scientific to become an academic discipline. That is, anthropology in its most restricted form. I'll finish there, because I'm just conscious there's about 5 minutes more. Do you want me to?
Finish it, go ahead.
Or open to
We
questions?
started a bit
Open it to the
Yes,
floor.
go ahead.
Okay.
Take your 5 minutes.
That brings us back to the future of the study of humankind. Sarah Green, from her vantage point in EASA, provides us with the modern equivalent of Toppenard's restricted form of the study of anthropology. However, 2/3 of anthropologists work outside of academic anthropology, and if Haddon's involvement with the Natural Field Club movement tells us anything, there are plenty of sites where the study of humankind in its widest aspect and most contrary nature is still happening. Sites where, as Kropotkin put it, people from diverse cultures are brought together in much closer contact than ever before. And as Haddon said, and in the study of anthropology, anthropology happens wherever people are found. To finish, the debate about the meaning and scope of anthropology that Haddon provoked in Ipswich in 1895 continues today between so-called traditionals and practicals. Those who look to an engaged humanitarian tradition for meaning, and those who see a science of practical utility as the only viable option. albeit one that requires the transformation of the discipline, the end of tradition, and the historiography that has sustained it. The irony here is that practical anthropology has its own history, which, as the records show, Haddon regarded as the antithesis of anthropology in its widest aspect. Haddon and his associates advocated a reform of sociology as a philosophical alternative to the evolutionist biology and Galton doctrine that subsequently provided anthropologists with the basis to claim that theirs was a truly social science. Perhaps that is why the history of anthropology is one of the discipline's most dangerous features. I am not a historian, although history is an integral part of the work I do as a curator, and I end on 3 short videos that document anthropology in its widest aspect in action in 2023. So this is July 15th of this year. Does anyone recognize?
Repatriation of bones.
We may have to optimize this for people online for the sound to come through.
There's no sound.
Ah, okay.
I think you've heard enough of me at this stage. Let the images speak for themselves. Now, for the folklorists amongst us, there's a little vignette here of a tradition that's practically gone. Just watch out for a young woman in black as the hearse passes on the right-hand side. Did you spot it?
No.
And the dog was there. Dogs are banned in Trinity. It's shuddering. This is Inishbofin Island. The tradition was for men only to carry the coffin to the graveyard. And this is the first all-female 4 that ever carried a coffin on the island. And, right. And, oh yeah, sorry, I'm not doing this very well.
Are you going to the website?
Yeah, no, I just need to bring up the link.
Should be open in the background.
So, oh Lord.
You still have to stop this and go to
Stop
the browser.
share and go into share screen.
If the browser's already open.
So in terms of Edmund Leach and all of that, and where anthropology stands today.
Should I have a look? We had it already open. Yes.
Oh, okay. I'm hitting the wrong part of the keyboard. And that's it.
Well, thank you very much for a very wide-ranging and detailed piece of work. It's wonderful when we can get down to the nitty-gritty like that, so we're greatly indebted to you. Well, I don't know whether anybody would like to ask. We'll begin with questions from the room and then we'll go to colleagues online. So, anybody like to ask something? Steve, go ahead, please.
Yeah, but, just to pick up on the repatriation of the bones, I know you've been involved in that. I saw Peggy Vale in there and the shot, so she was right there with you along. I wondered if you might actually tell us a little bit more information about the relationship to the theft of the bones and the photographs that we're seeing here in the exhibit. Is it the case that they took the photos in the day and they snuck around at night? I mean, it had to have been at the same trip. So is there a way that can we possibly look at these photographs in the wall and not think about the stolen bones? Are they sort of two sides of the same coin, if you will?
No, they're separate processes. And Inishbofin was in Inishbofin just before he reached the Aran Islands and took these 10 photographs, which were his first slideshow on the Aran Islands. And the photograph you saw of the skulls in situ in the ancient monastery was a photograph Haddon took while on Inishbofin. We haven't included it in this exhibition, but at the time Haddon had no interest whatsoever in physical anthropology, but he was aware of the requirement of providing physical anthropologists with the remains of savages.
Well, he did, I mean, from I could see from the film there, he did put his name to the skulls. So and he basically autographed them.
Okay.
So.
Haddon left the Aran Islands and was sacked as a marine biologist by Arthur James Balfour, Chief Secretary of Ireland and future Prime Minister, who organised the fishing survey that brought the SS Fingal to the Aran Islands. Haddon then had no option but to try and shift from marine biology into anthropology, given the success he had in London with his exhibition at the end of the 1888 to 89 expedition, and his generally positive reception in the Section H and the Anthropological Institute. However, to become an anthropologist in 1889, in 1890, you had to be a craniologist, because anthropology institutionally was governed by Galton, Cunningham, and Alexander McAllister and Beddoe, of course, in Alexander McAllister in Cambridge. And before he went to the Aran Islands, he read John Beddoe's report, which said that the field of ethnology in Ireland was untouched. And he saw a gap. When he was told of the skulls in Inishbofin, he saw a gap. And that he saw how he could fill that gap and get himself a position in Cambridge as the first anthropologist in the university.
So when he was trading in heads, even though he didn't necessarily believe in.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't see. I mean, it's all part of it. It's a piece of the same fabric that is his career. And I think that comes out very clearly, and that sort of detailed work you did, and clearly there's a lot of rich information you presented today. So I'm still left a little bit uncomfortable with thinking about the relationship between. I mean, this is in his Buffett here we're looking, but between the two sides of his, I feel like his professionalization.
Yeah.
So and they do, and I guess I think you were right to point out that this was a contradiction. This is something that it just seems impossible for us to square now. How do you put this, if you like, this humanistic sort of anti-colonial together with something that is, to us, seems like, I don't know, I mean, the whole the whole skullduggery of the bones transaction. I mean, anthropologists were kind of middlemen in native artifacts as well. I mean, that was happening in North America as well. So they were sort of buying and trading goods as a way of sort of professionalizing themselves. I mean, this is another sort of trade. I mean, but it is all part of a kind of political economy of what it means to be a professional anthropologist in the late 19th century, which is a trade-off. Which is, you're implicit, in order to be successful, you're implicit in this skullduggery, so.
But in 1898, he took responsibility for the report on physical anthropology in the Torres Straits, a report that was never published. Once a craniologist had been appointed to the first university lectureship in anthropology in his place, hadn't abandoned that physical anthropology. And in 1935, when he did publish the first volume of the Torres Straits report, Haddon Quiggin noted that the section on physical anthropology will probably never be written. So it was like, and we go back to someone like Donna Haraway and the whole idea of situated knowledges, like his involvement in craniology was simply trying to replicate the academic training that Cunningham was developing in Trinity College Dublin as the basis for a job in Cambridge. And he got beaten to it by an anatomically trained craniologist.
So the rest of the case for the defence.
Well, no, I'm just interpreting the,
More questions, please.
Well,
Go ahead.
I mean, I was wanting to ask a similar thing. It's always seemed to me an incredible contradiction, or maybe you've answered it once and for all, Ciaran, but I think you can also say, can't you, that at the time of the 1898 expedition, where he takes with him psychologists to do psychological tests, and they're largely proved to be inconclusive at best, that the psychological dimension is also abandoned in favor of the sociological. Would you?
Yeah, and like there's a lot of work that needs to be done on Rivers and Haddon and the psychological connection. But James Cattell-Keeney was a big fan of Galton, and he argued that Galton's methods had to be used to convert psychology into a science. Rivers and Cattell-Keeney knew one another. But also in 1898, Haddon published a study of man, which was edited by Cattell-Keeney. So, and I suspect that's why psychology played such a big role in the 1898 expedition.
I was thinking of all those tests, like do the people of the islands have better sense perception than people, and they found that it was pretty much the same as Aberdeen fishermen and Girton villagers, and there was as much a big difference within a population as there was between them. Sorry, I'm not saying psychology altogether lost out, because Myers, of course, was crucial in the establishment of psychology as a discipline.
But the whole thing, though, about that measurement, the laboratory that was set up, the physical characteristics and the sensory capacities, that was all proving a method. And as Galton said, that unless something can be proved by measurement, it doesn't merit the title science. So 1898 was about ethnography, about turning ethnography into a laboratory science in the field. And it gets really ridiculous when you look at an almost contemporaneous negotiations that were going on between the Royal Anthropological Institute and the Folklore Society about an amalgamation, because the folklorists are trying desperately to show how they can convert the collection of folklore into a science. So all within this, from 1890 onwards, you have this shift towards statistics-based laboratory methods, which was called anthropometry, or as Alexander McAllister called it in 1894, scientific anthropology. And in the same speech, he turns around to Haddon. Well, he addresses Haddon not by name, but he just says that this man has lived among the savages and can bring that perspective to the study of humankind, but that's not really central to what we're about. It's more the domain of the philosophical anthropologist, and he didn't mean that as a compliment.
I have a quick question. The funding for this expedition, where did that come from?
For which, the 1890?
Yes.
1890 was, local elections were introduced into Great Britain in 1888, and the Tories started hemorrhaging votes in the local elections.
Right.
So Galton, Balfour, getting my bogeymen mixed up. Balfour suddenly realised that the Tories were going to lose power in the 1892 general election. So he switched his policies from coercion, which earned him the nickname Arthur Bloody Balfour, after the shooting of protesters in Mitchelstown. He switched his policy from coercion to killing home rule with kindness, as his brother subsequently called it in 1895. And as part of that, he funded marine research to try and generate and to try and stimulate a fishing industry in the west of Ireland. So the funding came directly from Balfour as head of the political administration, the British administration in Dublin, but was directed through the Royal Dublin Society, because Balfour could not be accused, could not be seen to be engaged in market distortion or state socialism. So the RDS were asked to come on board. They came on board. They had worked with Haddon on fisheries research, the photograph on the cover of the book, and they appointed Haddon as chief naturalist of the survey of fishing grounds, West Coast, which brought Haddon to the Aran Islands. And the slideshow there is crucial because Haddon left the survey for a week to carry out his ethnological researches in the Aran Islands, and Green, the director of the survey and second in line to Balfour, said that Haddon was too distracted by hairy rooms and gay gentians instead of concentration on what the business at hand, which was fishing. So at the end of that week, Haddon was finished as a marine biologist.
This is his resignation over.
Yeah.
Can I ask another about Freemasonry? What was Haddon's attraction to that? I mean, he remained a Freemason, and I think he was the member of Grand Master of a Lodge in Cambridge at some point. And
Along with Gom, along with Lawrence Gom.
So can you talk a little bit about what role Freemasonry played in your conception of Haddon's radicalism?
Philosophy, in a word, Michael. One of the more interesting aspects of my research was trying to blag my way into an initiation ceremony in the Grand Lodge in Dublin. And the librarian there, Rebecca, she was wonderful. Like, she searched all the archives. I was trying to figure out, in terms of, actor network theories and stuff like that, I was trying to figure out what role Freemasonry played in Haddon's perception, of course, universality, reconstruction, and Henry Havelock Ellis and Haddon shared a long conversation about anthropology as the main instrument of social reconstruction in England in the 1890s. And so that word, I mean, like with Rebecca and the Freemasons, we spent a lot of time working around the idea of reconstruction. But essentially, Haddon was initiated a couple of months in Dublin, a couple of months before he went to the Torres Strait. And the first thing he experiences when he goes into the field is an initiation dance. And that piece that I quoted from Lippincott's magazine is so crucial in terms of the rupture that happened. There's a series of little ruptures that separate Haddon from Huxley. So he went on to Cambridge, and I think around 1908, I can't remember exactly, he reached the highest level of spiritual enlightenment that is possible within Freemasonry. And when he was rejected by Cambridge University, he wrote to Myers and say, I have need of with all the disappointments I've experienced recently, I have need of all my philosophies. But I think basically, in terms of that was just one level that built on his grandparents' involvement in the anti-slavery movement. And one has to remember that his uncle was named Wilberforce. His two aunts were founding members of the Fabian Society, and his aunt Caroline Haddon was heavily criticised for an anonymous article on marriage, the socialist view of marriage. But the same woman also funded Havelock Ellis's medical training in preparation for his study of sex and sexuality. And so, you know, the philosophy, there are many layers of philosophy, but one of the big arguments David and I had at my Viva, I had to go through my thesis and take out about 200 radicals, and it was about trying to define whether it was a radical political philosophy or whether it was a philosophy that was rooted in his membership of the Freemasons, and it was actually somewhere in between. And he was more radical by association than radical in belief.
Yeah, I mean, the fascinating thing is how he reflects earlier debates. I'm very pleased you brought up the Wilberforce thing, because you see, the quotation, the long and convincing quotation that you read out, is almost identical in language to the reports of the Aboriginal Protection Society from 60 years before. And then what happened, of course, is that the Aboriginal Protection Society gave way to the Ethnological Society of London, with a much softer approach, and saying it's fine that we've got people who are in the Aboriginal Protection Society, we applaud that, but we also want to do research. So that's where you get this emerging. It's wonderful that you can trace it through to this tradition of nonconformism, because it was a Quaker movement, of course. And
there's one area that needs to be investigated more. Is Frederick Douglass, just before he died, came to England, and you had a contemporary revival of the Aborigines Protection Society, and in 1895 an amalgamation with the anti-slavery movement. So, you know, this is going on in the background in 1895, and the man in the middle of the photograph, Reverend Samuel J. Houghton, was also a home ruler, but his cousins in Carlow were involved in the anti-slavery movement as well. So the thing, you know, I at the beginning of my research, it was very easy to show Haddon the headhunter, the colonial scientist who went back west to find the Black Irish, and disproved their capacity for home rule. And it's actually complete fiction. All the evidence that, you know, shows that this is a man whose heritage was grounded in the Aborigines Protection Society. But for Hodgkin to get access to research funding under the British Association, he had to stop criticising the church, state and empire. And that's what Morel and Thackeray meant by stripping ethnology of its most dangerous features. And in 1898, when Haddon revived the Aborigines Protection Society agenda and got hammered in the press, the British Association refused to fund a second expedition to the Torres Straits that himself and James G. Fraser were planning. And the whole trope of taking anthropology out of the armchair is that Fraser was meant to travel to the Pacific with Haddon, but McGregor in Australia told him to stay at home, stay in his armchair.
Well, we must see if our colleagues online would like to make any points, but don't forget that at the same time as this type of anthropology was emerging, in Oxford, as well as Fraser and Cambridge, social anthropology was emerging.
Yes.
And part of it is around that 1895 meeting in Ipswich. If I remember rightly, I think that was the location of Marrett's revision of Tyler's understanding of spirituality and religion that made him very, very famous and he said himself, this will get me a footnote in the history of anthropology, and now he does. There's always a little footnote that says, and Marrett revised this theory of Tyler on religion. So we've got social anthropology emerging as well as the other kind of anthropologies at the same time.
But social anthropology never went away. It's just that in the 1850s, Huxley directed anthropology, having survived the amalgamation or the infighting that preceded the formation of the Institute in 1871, Huxley directed anthropology towards biology, and you have this period of about 10 years where ethnology and anthropology are moving from the ethnological department of the geographic to the biological department, and they're moving all around. And it's only in 1884 that it becomes established as a section in its own right. But Huxley was using the survival of the fittest to combat the influence of the Chartist movement. He came back and got involved, and he came back to England and got involved in anthropology after the Chartist movement. And he gave lectures in working men's clubs, arguing that the survival of the fittest was the only way forward in a stable capitalist system. And that brought him into a head-to-head in the pages of the Fortnightly magazine into a row with Kropotkin. And that's where Kropotkin's book on mutuality begins. So the social dimension, and this is like a key part of the book, and it's sort of a problem I had when you're reading like from 1993, 91 onwards, from the Savage Within is the most cited book on this period. And you have this historiography that actually bears no relation to the facts. And the struggle of anthropology in its widest aspect began with the Ethnological Society and never ended.
But there are 5 questions here. Let's see if we can get them
there's also Anita Hurley had raised her hand for quite a while.
Excellent. Well, let's begin with the hand up then.
Yeah,
Are you
but
still there,
she
Anita?
removed her hand again.
No,
we should check in, because
Absolutely.
I'm sure she would have something.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there she is. Okay.
Great. Come on in live, Anita, please.
you-
Nice to hear from you.
Yeah, please unmute.
Hello, thank you, everyone. I don't know if you can see me or just hear me.
No,
We can just hear you, but that's fine.
Okay,
You're
that's
quite
fine.
clear.
Anyways, first of all, I'd just like to thank Ciaran for a very stimulating seminar. It was fascinating, and I really look forward to reading the book. My comment, sort of a combination of comments and perhaps a question, which go back to the initial points that were made. I should say that in my work in Torres Strait and thinking about Haddon and the work that he did in Torres Strait, I have myself often found it very difficult to reconcile Haddon's humanitarianism and inquiries with his at least initial attitude to the collection of human remains, which at time was done, in secrecy. But I think another factor that, and I don't completely agree that Haddon was only involved in physical anthropology because it was something that he sort of had to do professionally, because it really fit in with what his big questions were, which, the big questions about the movement of people and characteristics and the movement of skills and populations throughout the Pacific, or indeed throughout the UK, which at first was he looked at from an evolutionary point of view, but then later diffusionism was also an equally productive paradigm for him to think about the movement of these things. But I just wanted to highlight, I think one of the main things here is field work. I mean, Haddon has been attributed as being one of the first anthropologists to use the word field work in what he did in his work in Torres Strait, which obviously enables a sort of kind of intimacy between Haddon and the people he was working with. I mean, when he went as a marine biologist, he was working with the men on Mare and Mabiag, so, you know, dredging the sand and going out to the reef. Those were his constant companions. And I think that what you can see is a change in Haddon's attitudes. Certainly, we make this point in Recording Custom. Sorry, is that noise coming from me?
No, it's coming from us. I'm sorry. Do go ahead. It's somebody
Okay, I
cutting
wasn't
out
sure if you could hear
the
me,
speak.
but I'm
No,
just emphasizing the importance of field work and the kinds of relationships that develop in the field and the effect that that had on some of Haddon's ideas. So you get early physical anthropology mugshots, which become the portraits of his best mates in the Torres Strait. And you can sort of see this transformation. And I would argue that part of that is because of the field work and because of the intimacy and the relationships that he had with islanders that actually changed some of his attitudes. And you can see this very much in the photography. So I guess if I have a question, it's to go back to the part 2 of your talk, which is to ask you, I mean, certainly I've tried to show this with the Torres Strait corpus, but whether with the visual anthropology, the important photography work that Haddon was doing in the Aran Islands, do you also see the sort of relationships that are developing, or was he not there too long enough?
So were the same friendships formed in the Aran Islands as in the Torres Straits of New Guinea?
Yeah.
I started the drill behind, took the last. No, because in total, Haddon was in the Aran Islands for, like, the first visit was for 6 days. Then he spent a day in 1891 just rune hunting and photographing. And then the survey, the ethnographic survey of the islands probably took place over a week, judging on the records of measurements. But the key and the first photograph that he opened the 1890 slideshow is of a teacher, and that teacher acted as his guide for almost 3 years, and I think, and hadn't subsequently recruited him as a folklore collector. And the key thing about that is that the teacher insisted, like, it's an incredible photograph because it captures all sorts of levels of information, and the nature of the glacial karst landscape with the flowers that fed animals growing between the cracks. But you have a teacher who insisted on teaching through reviving the Irish language as the vernacular of education on the islands. And then in the background you have the Dunangus Fort, which was probably built by some of the earliest settlers on the island. And so Haddon developed this relationship, but nothing like the friendships he developed in the Torres Straits.
Okay.
Does that answer your question, Anita?
Yeah, it does. I mean, obviously it was much more survey work, but I'm just sort of trying to also position it because the Irish work is between the 2 expeditions.
Yes.
2 Torres Strait expeditions, and it's really in the second one where you start to see these relationships really develop.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, I'm just putting that in relationship to his changing interest and focus on anthropomorphic kind of work.
Yeah, and he became a sort of a defense, like it. I suppose the You can see from one of the main influences in a lot of the stuff he wrote about the Aran Islands, and on his return, the influence of Tomato Chalmers and the idea of, as he said, as I said in the talk there, the development of native institutions as naturally as possible, and it sort of goes back to Chalmers saying, a Papua and like an indigenous missionary to reduce the influence of Europeans, and a Papua for Papuans. And that is a thread that continues from the 1888 to 9 fieldwork into the Aran Islands and into the debate about home rule which followed it.
Fascinating.
But in terms of friendships, no, they were very short term.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your thoughts, and you two, which are very valuable as always. So now we've got a few questions that have been sent in by text. So let's try and get through them all.
Yeah.
Medium brief answers, not very brief, medium brief. And I'll start with the easy ones. So Patricia Lysite asks, as far as I could see, the coffin in which the Trinity skulls were reburied in Inishbofin Island didn't have names inscribed on them. Was this because the skulls could not be identified?
Yes, the skulls dated from, I think, 1509 to 1645. That was their date. So, and we didn't do, we allowed 2 days between collecting the skulls and burying them to allow for DNA sampling. But in the end, it was decided that the ethical thing to do was no interference. Just take them from the display case and bury them. So we never knew, but our research showed that 1509 to 1645 was started with Henry VIII's Reformation, suppression of the monasteries, the establishment of Trinity, into the Williamite War, 1601, the Battle of Kinsale, and the destruction of the Gaelic order forever. So they embody a critical period in Irish history, but we weren't able to identify that. And one thing about the coffin, it is a traditional island coffin, except that it's divided into 13 compartments, and the only thing, Marie Coyne was very upset because the carpenter varnished it, and never varnish used on a traditional island coffin.
Wow, thank you very much. But just in passing, you said that Trinity College Dublin weren't very enthusiastic about giving them back at first?
It took 10 years, and they still hold another 11, the remains of 11 individuals that Haddon and Dixon stole in 1890.
Oh.
And that is still going on.
Yeah. Right, we'll crack on. Well, that's absolutely fascinating. You'll have to come back and give another talk about that. So Shane Morton would ask, did Kropotkin have a direct influence on Haddon?
Yes.
And how does your work on Haddon encourage us to rethink the broader role that the ethnography of the West of Ireland has played in the development of social anthropology?
Say that again.
What influence has the ethnography of the West of Ireland had on the development of social anthropology?
No.
There's your answer.
None in terms of the seven reports published between 1893, the first one being the ethnography of the Aran Islands, and the last one being one in Connemara. And essentially they were the beginning of social anthropology in Ireland is attributed to the arrival of the Harvard anthropological expedition to Ireland in the 1930s. But the interesting thing there, and what tracking the word mutuality and Kropotkin's influence on Haddon through the various documents, is that Warner, who designed the social anthropology program for the Harvard mission, was mentored by Radcliffe Brown, who was Haddon's apprentice. And what you can actually trace through the various documents, how Kropotkin, who, as far as I can tell, never met, or Radcliffe Brown never met Kropotkin. Ian Langham says that possibly they bumped into one another while on holidays. But that Haddon seems to be the conduit from the go-between between anarchism, Kropotkin, and Radcliffe Brown. And Radcliffe Brown then passes that on to Warner, who designs the social anthropology program for the Harvard expedition to Ireland in the 1930s. So until we published Brown's photograph albums, there was no interest whatsoever in the ethnography that Haddon and Brown wrote on the Aran Islands and the 7 others that Brown wrote, except to prove that anthropology in Ireland in the 1890s was the antithesis of the Gaelic cultural revival and literary modernism.
Thank you. Well, that answers Shane's question. Thank you. Now, Nathan Sydenham would like to ask, thank you very much for a thought-provoking presentation. I'm interested in your work as a biographer of sorts. What sense of responsibility do you feel, and do you feel any moral obligation towards Haddon's friends and family? After all, is it possible to know the inner life of another, and how do you tackle this dilemma within your research and its dissemination?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time working on the theory of microbiology. This is one of those lenses that I used temporarily and cast aside. I'm still in contact with Margaret Rishbit and Prill Rishbit and her daughter Claire, who attended. Like, it was a very important part of the repatriation process that we reversed the process. And Claire Rishbit, and excuse me, Claire, if you're listening to this, but she was very apprehensive about the reception she would get on the island. You know, this was the great granddaughter of the man who stole the skulls. But after that little statement in the church, it was just completely transformed, and it made perfect sense as to why she was there. So as to the responsibility as a biographer, I'm not a biographer, I'm a curator. I work with photographs, and so my access to Haddon was trying to understand why he took these photographs, to situate those photographs in what he was doing at a particular time, to use Donna Haraway's model. But I've spent 10 years with Haddon, and you develop a sort of a literary Stockholm syndrome where you begin to become almost an alter ego of the person you're writing about. And there were certain things that Haddon did that really resonated with me. And I look back at his sketchbook as a child, and I look back at my own sketchbooks. I wasn't allowed to do art in school, so I went to the Crawford School of Art, a bit like Haddon. And it was just, you know, there were a lot of personal connections like that. But it doesn't mean that I don't call Haddon a craniologist. No, he was a craniologist. He wrote the first of a series of studies in Irish craniology, which the Royal Irish Academy published in 1893. He was a craniologist, and there were other things that he did, which were like he stole the skulls. There's no denying that. And even though subsequently he denied that he ever stole anything from a native village, because of a scandal in the Pacific. So, do I feel an obligation to the family? Yes, absolutely. But also one of the key things very late in the writing of that book, which caused a major rewrite, was the discovery of a family history of the John Haddon printing family, which has, by the Reverend Croft, you know, Michael, which was where I discovered that Haddon's grandmother was a painter, his mother was a writer, and they were all involved in philanthropic work and humanitarian activism. The 3 generations before, the 2 generations before Haddon went into the field. So yeah, it's and I say that in the introduction, that Haddon's family background was far more significant than Huxley's influence. And I say that because Haddon, when I started looking at Haddon, the first thing you would read, and I still think, what's the chatbot or whatever it is, Haddon, pupil of Huxley, is still there. It's part of the history, it's still there.
Yeah, thank you very much. And there's just one more comment here, which we can end with perhaps. And Aidan Baker says, what was the message that Haddon's modern kinswoman, Claire Isbeth, took to the ceremony where the skulls were returned. So maybe he couldn't hear it on the screen.
What was the message? She apologised. That was quite a snippet, but what she said, you can't undo the past, but you celebrate the present. And then she said, I apologise for on behalf of her family. She apologised for the theft of the skulls. But it was it was funny. She met us in Cleggan and we travelled out on a boat, just 6 or 7 of us on a boat with the remains, and she helped load. Now, it was quite interesting. At the pier, the coffin was taken off us by 4 islanders and carried, but from that point on, the Haddon family was officially represented at every aspect of the funeral. And that goes back to the earlier question about how I relate to the Haddon family, in a sense, like I have no option but to relate to them. And talked about their great grandfather.
Well, I think we're just about at the end, but what are we going to do now? Well, we're going to celebrate the launch of this book. We've probably got some wine somewhere in our coffers, I hope we have, and we shall have a look at the photograph exhibition. So
yeah, and I'd just like to thank everyone who turned up here and everyone who turned up online. It just makes so much sense sitting here in the Anthropological Institute, where he was president and a physical president in. Yeah, he was last. Like, I just saying that. I just bear with me. Tyler demanded, after 10 years of rule by physical anthropologists, that every other year a cultural would take the presidency of the institute, and that was a huge windfall for me as a researcher, because suddenly the infighting between physicals and culturals became part of the annual presidential address. It's all there. It's fascinating. But Haddon was the last person in that cycle of appointments, and going by that cycle, he was a physical president, not a cultural.
Well, there we are. There we are. We're really out of time now. So thank you very much indeed. We're greatly.
Thank you, everyone.
Actually, I should sit around and watch the Man of Iran film from the 1931 Flaherty film. We should sit around.
But that's Steve. It's